Thank you, Anmar, and good morning, Lenaro Connect. Well done for getting up. I don't know if I would have gotten up at this stage in a 4-day conference. Grant was telling me that it used to be 5 days. I don't know how anybody does a 5-day conference, but well done. Great to see the stamina. So I'm the CEO at a company called Open UK. We're an industry organization, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about me, about Open UK, and talk to you about the state of open source and how it's under pressure today. And I often get asked how a nice girl like me ended up in a space like open source. Back in 2008, I joined a company that I know you all know, Canonical, commercial sponsor of the Ubuntu operating system. And I'm an ex-lawyer, I'm recovering. I spent 25 years as a lawyer. And in 2008, I joined Canonical as its first lawyer. And I went there for 3 months and ended up staying 5 years. And something unexpected happened. And the unexpected was that I sort of fell in love with open source. And I was a commercial corporate lawyer with a strong technology experience, and that really wasn't expected. And actually, there's a few people in the room, including Anmar, who I worked with back then. And one of the things that I did in my 5 years at Canonical was a contract with a chap called Phil David, who was the general counsel at ARM. And that contract was made public in July 2010, and it created something called Linaro, which I know you're all familiar with. So that was something that was a very big deal for us back in the day at Canonical. And since I left Canonical, I went the wrong way. I told them last night I was good at clicking, and I'm proving myself wrong. I've stayed involved in the open source community, but maybe not the communities that you all move in. So I've been very involved in the legal and governance communities across open source. And that's resulted in me sitting on a lot of different advisory boards, including some that are government appointed. And this is a kind of odd thing for me. I have a sort of odd relationship with this, but I'm on all sorts of lists in the UK, sort of power lists and influencer lists in tech. And that's not really so much about me as about the ascendancy of open source and the recognition that open source is getting today. I have ADHD. You may already have noticed that as I jump around through my slides, and I have a lot of slides and we don't have a lot of time. I edited this book and it's 640 pages long. It is the worst thing I have ever done. It has 26 authors, mainly lawyers, and it's sort of the text on open source law. Now, the QR code isn't trying to flog you the book. The QR code goes to a website where there is open access. So if you want a free copy of the book, you can get it there. You don't have to read 640 pages. Nobody expects that. It's very well indexed. So if you look up the index, you'll find the topics you or your legal team need to know about in open source. So please take that as please use it. It was the worst thing I've ever done. What was really unexpected about the book was it went viral, and it went viral on the Chinese internet. And as a consequence of that, it's ended up being translated into Mandarin. And this is some of the community in China who are doing that translation. There's about 30 people, and they will be releasing the book in October. And part of my role is that I travel the world talking about open source and Open UK's work. And our purpose is UK leadership and global collaboration. And that global collaboration is critical because at the heart of everything open source, of course, is collaboration. Now, we are made up of a group of several hundred people. I think we're the biggest community that doesn't have a code-based output in open source. And you may recognize already somebody on that slide who's in the room. We have 3 employees, and I think what we deliver is quite incredible. And that comes from the fact that we have such an active and strong community. And we're actually announcing this morning a new group, this AI advisory board, which is looking at AI and openness. And it's bringing together some world-leading experts. I'm going to go over time because I wasn't going to tell you this. But at the bottom, there's a chap called Torrin Bruce Richards, who's a 26-year-old in Edinburgh, who's just raised 12 million for AutoGPT. You may know AutoGPT. It is the fastest growing open source repository in the world, and it's an AI agent. So we have this big community that pull together, and we're unusual in that we focus on open tech, so software, hardware, data, AI standards, not just software, but also we focus on people. And we believe that if you focus on people, the companies will follow. And it's particularly important when you're outside of the US or China, because most of the people we work with actually work for international companies, working from home, but collaborating globally. Now, we have 3 pillars: community, legal and policy, and learning. We deliver our community work through things like awards and honor system to recognize open source and bring people together. We use their voice, their collective voice, to have influence on law. We respond, we've got a big group of lawyers, we respond to legislation to try and make it open source friendly. And then we set the policy agenda. We've done a lot on sustainability. We had a big event at COP26. And in 2021, we started doing research and reporting. Our survey, we do an annual survey, and we have more data about open source than any country in the world. And that survey comes out today. So I'll share the QR code. The survey analysis will be shared in our next report and a party in London. Any of you London-based, take the QR code and come and join us. We'd love to see you. And that will be at the Digital Catapult in London. And then our third pillar is about learning. And the circle we have is you bring the community together, you influence law and policy, you educate your future community, and it just will keep going in a perpetual circle. So we've done a kids camp, and we do lots of training for adults. We have a large conference. It's coming up to its 3rd year now. One of the most diverse conferences across tech or open source. And that's the date for next year if you'd like to join us in London. But the organization is about engendering this sense of belonging and bringing people together. So what I'm really meant to be talking to you about is open source, right? Open source being under pressure. So what is it, and why does it matter to us today? Well, I thought we could start the day by reciting together the 10 points of the open source definition. Are you ready? Okay, because nobody can do it. Even the person that wrote it sat down with me and was looking at a crib sheet. For me, what matters is 5 and 6. 5 is anybody can use open source anywhere without restriction, and 6 is for any purpose. And that's something that we need to think about all the time when we're looking at the pressures on open source. So when Randy Linnell and I, back in the Canonical days, were trying to sell open source software, it was really, really hard. We were knocking at doors and we weren't getting in. And we weren't getting in because risk professionals like me, lawyers, procurement people, finance people, were blocking the way because they didn't understand the risk. Now, how do we go from that to 96% of software stacks today having dependencies on open source? Well, we go to that through digitalization. You know, there's a few things, but for me, digitalization is one of the keys, because what that did was make every company a software company. And at the same time, it elevated the role of all of you, of the engineers. It made engineers decision makers. Add that to the rise of Git, GitHub, GitLab, and what you see is engineers bringing the code into the organization and bypassing those risk professionals till we get to the stage we're at today, where open source is the norm. I think the best way I've ever found of explaining it is Microsoft. So when I joined Canonical, we had a thing called Launchpad, still exists, and Bug Zero on Launchpad was the destruction of Microsoft. I used to know a lot of jokes, and the punchline of every joke was Microsoft. I can't tell them anymore because Microsoft has been on this journey, and Microsoft has gone from 20 years ago with its CEO saying that open source is a cancer, to today, 2018 here, with Steve Wally, who is one of the leading people in open source in Microsoft, on a stage in Edinburgh, keynoting Linux Foundation's Open Source Summit and telling that journey, telling that story. It's well worth watching. It's about 15 minutes. But what Steve says is 3 things. You cannot hire engineers who've learned to code in the last 20 years and not have them do open source. That's how they've been taught. That's what they understand. So if you want to hire good people, you have to do open source. Secondly, so much innovation that's cutting edge has been made open source that if you have customers coming to you and asking for those named packages, you have to provide them. And thirdly, if you want to do cloud, if you want to be in the platform economy, run a business like Azure, then you really have to not just use open source, but engage with the open source community. And for me, that's a journey. It's a journey that not just every tech company, but every company and the public sector is on. So going back to the UK, which I know best, I say that, but I originally said no to being in Open UK because I hadn't done any work in the UK for like 20 years, right? So the idea of engaging a local community was very new to me.
And what I discovered is we're number one in Europe, and I'm not allowed to tell you that this is January's figure of 3.2 million accounts, but actually we've got 3.6 million GitHub accounts in the UK. Now that's not more than any country in the world, but it is 4.7% at the 3.2 and 5% at the 3.6 million of the UK population. So 5% of the UK population has a GitHub account. And GitHub accounts are one of the traditional ways of measuring open source contribution. And what you see with 5% of the population is that we have more per capita than any country in the world. So when we talk about the UK being the state of open, I really mean that. And we use this submarine because it helps people who are not in open source understand how we float along under the digital economy. We contribute masses to the economy, we collaborate, we give back to our geographic area, but actually we're collaborating globally, and often our local people, our local tech sector don't know us. Now, whilst we're number one, Macron has really been pushing the agenda in France, and I know there's a few of you I was talking to last night who are based in France or French, and what we're seeing is that France is the fastest growing open source economy in Europe. So, pressure? What pressure? Open source is won. Time to go home. But is it sustainable? This room is what I would call Gen 1, and I include myself in this, right? And it's not just because of our age, it's because of when we engaged and how we engage with open source. And we're looking at distros, we're looking at Linux, right? There's a generation that came 20 years later. They're celebrating their 10th birthday on the 6th of June. Gen 2, for me, the Kubernetes generation. Now, when Gen 1 got into open source, we knew what we were doing. We still know what we're doing when we make those decisions. We understood proprietary and we understood what we wanted to be. We understood what open source was. Gen 2 started doing open source because that's what they'd been taught. They didn't necessarily understand that it was open source. They just knew that was what they were doing. And even many of those you talk to about open source, it's not that they just can't recite the 10 open source definitions. They don't really understand where open source came from or what matters, what the nuances are. And then Gen 3, who knows? This is the AI generation. They're working out what they are and what open source and AI is. So one of the problems we have is that nobody owns the trademark open source. The OSI, when it was formed, was told not to register it. And what that means is that they can't enforce it. So if open source is misused, they can't do much about it. And one of the things that we always have with open source is FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. And the reason we have that is that we can't enforce the meaning. Now, people see open source going into a new sector, they see it coming into their sector, and what happens is disruption. And with that disruption, what comes is disruption to your business model, disruption to the economics. And of course, people fight back. And that FUD allows challenges. But those challenges haven't just come from outside open source, right? In the last 4 or 5 years, we've seen some real issues. Now, I know it's not the first report ever done on open source and business models, but this came out in my first 6 months at Canonical. And this report was very clear that there are 8 business models. They're still much the same today, although they're often called different things. Good report if you want to set up your own business and understand it. But what it makes clear is that open source is not a business model. Now, in 2012, I think Canonical was probably one of the first companies that really faced this challenge. We went from 0 to 76% of the cloud marketplace in OSs almost overnight, and we didn't have a business model to support it. So the revenue that goes with being 76% market share didn't flow our way, and that was tough, right? So anybody who set up a business in the following years should have known about the threat of cloud. I've heard it described as one day you have an open source business and the next day you have a feature in the cloud. And that can happen. And what we've seen is within open source, some of our companies, as they've grown, as they've IPO'd, as they've taken investment, we've seen them move away, move in the wrong direction towards proprietary. Sometimes it's disingenuous. This caused a lot of stir in 2021 when Shay Bannon, who is a proper open source person who understands it, put this post out, this blog post saying we're doubling down on open, when in fact what he was doing was taking Elasticsearch away from open source onto a license called the SSPL, the server-side public license. A license which doesn't allow that free flow, it has restrictions, it doesn't meet the open source definition. Now, that's not something from like 3-4 years ago that isn't active and live. Last August, one of our poster child, I don't know how I say that. So the poster child of open source, HashiCorp, moved away from an open source license. They moved to something called the BSL, sometimes referred to as the bullshit license. You'll remember that. And HashiCorp moved to this proprietary license. Nobody quite knew why. They were making money. And when we've seen these license changes, the companies have always been making money. And in this case, we think they were probably prepping for sale, and you see them being sold 2-3 weeks ago to IBM. But of course, if you look back in August, their share price was also massively lower than it was on IPO. And they have this shareholder value pressure. We've also seen issues with Redis Labs. Redis created something called the Commons Clause. You may know it. It was something that the open source community hate. It basically is a clause that restricts open source by saying you cannot use it commercially. And you add it to an open source license and you invalidate the license. And there was so much pushback, they stopped using it. But then again, this year, they've moved to a dual licensing model. And as a response to that, for the first time, we've seen the Linux Foundation support forks of both Redis and HashiCorp's products. And it'll be interesting to see where that goes, because a fork is the ultimate tool of the community, the ability to lift and shift when you don't believe in what your leadership is doing. But then, of course, we have to see where the code goes, because that's where the winner will be. So you see these restrictions on that free flow of software, even from our own community, impacting open source, seeing businesses move away, break the social contract, the unwritten contract they have across the open source community. And then you see things like sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word that we see a lot in Europe. We're not so keen in it in the UK, despite Brexit. And this picture is at FOSDEM in 2020. And actually, this is like 2 minutes before Brexit happened. And I use Brexit, not because I particularly believe in it. You don't really care whether you do or not. It's what it is now. We were outside the commission after FOSDEM at the moment in time that Brexit happened. We were standing there at midnight and they put the lights out. Now, I don't know if they do that every night, but it was really poignant. And I don't think I've ever seen or heard of a moment where there has been a geopolitical shift that you could point to the second of. And what that did was it meant that a lot of people in Europe didn't want to collaborate with us in the UK anymore. It's only recently that the Commission has come round to allowing us to be back on a stage. And then we see wars. And this is not the only war going on. But it was heartbreaking because I had a colleague from Canonical who was in Ukraine who asked me to get involved in this protest where they were looking at restricting code going into Russia. And of course, we make no judgment. We don't make the ethical and moral decisions in open source. It's not just about commercial restriction. There is no restriction on who can use code, and I couldn't get involved. And as a consequence of our success, the regulators are panicking. This piece has a very unfortunate headline, I think, but they start to see not just businesses and enterprise infrastructure, but our national infrastructure and our national critical infrastructure being built on open source. Oh, lost the slides. So what they start to worry about is you still have something. I just lost it here. So what they start to worry about is security, and they worry about risk and liability. And there is a need for somebody somewhere to take on that risk. Somebody has to be responsible when you're a government or a lawmaker. And it used to be that that was always the end user. And what we're seeing is a shift, and we're seeing a shift that's been led by the White House, and that comes to the Cyber Resilience Act. Now, I'll just spend a minute on the Cyber Resilience Act, And the Cyber Resilience Act is something that I've been told yesterday by a colleague in a foundation isn't that bad, but I think is terrible. And I think it's terrible because a year ago it was terrible. And what's happened is we've had some improvements, and those improvements include the fact that we've got a carve out now from liability for our foundation. So if you put your code into a foundation, there is a carve out from the liability requirements. However, what they've not succeeded in doing is protecting the individual developers, the small companies, and the innovators. So if you make money out of your open source code, which is something that I think is fair and reasonable to do because you have to eat and you have to have a roof over your head. If you make money in any form out of that code, you are going to be liable for it. And what I think that's going to do is I think it's going to have a an effect on Europe that's the opposite of what they wanted. And I think the effect will be that you won't distribute your code into Europe. You'll put up a 404. You won't allow GitHub to download it across Europe because you won't want to take the liability. But who will take the liability will be the big systems integrators, because they'll aggregate that code and bring it into Europe and take the risk, because it's the first distributor who makes money out of it who's liable. Thankfully, in the UK, although there are security regulations around IoT, in terms of general security regulation, we're still at consultation phase. Europe hasn't finished. The Cyber Resilience Act is not enough. They're doing a product liability directive as well. That follows the same approach as the Cyber Resilience Act. It makes software a product. It used to always be a service, and that changes the whole landscape from a liability perspective. And anybody who creates software is going to be a manufacturer. We see pressure with our maintainers, right? There's an inequity, an imbalance between what's been given to people who are creating this code, giving it away, gifting it to the world, and these big companies making millions and billions of dollars out of it. And we see a friction there. The XV backdoor that you've heard about this week, I don't need to tell you any more about that, but what we've also seen is more pressure on maintainers with a set of rules and guidelines that they ought to follow. And then we have this thing with end users, where end users are blindly taking code, not knowing what they're doing, right? Somebody who uses code has to be responsible for how they're doing it and understand what they're doing. And what that means is you generate the skills yourself, you buy those skills in, money changes hands, and somebody else will take on the liability. And we tend to call that now curation, that good technical hygiene and the good governance of the code. And then last but not least, I can't do anything about pressure without talking about AI. And we have this whole piece that everybody's still working out on what's going on with copyright and whether that will be different in different countries. So you put your code in, what you get out, even if it was copyrighted, even if it had a license, is that going to be copyrighted? We also see maintainers under more pressure because they're starting to be dumped on with loads of AI-generated code. And this all kicked off a year ago. And it kicked off a year ago with ChatGPT rather. And then we saw Llama 2 being released by Meta. And it started with the leak of Llama 1. Llama 2, when it was released, was done in a structured way on a license that is not open source. And OpenUK made a decision to be part of that release because we're about the general open, not just open source. And it was characterized very clearly as open innovation. That's what their website says. But as soon as Zuckerberg launched it, he did what we would call open washed, and he called it open source. But of course, it's not, because it doesn't have that free flow. There are restrictions on how you use it, and there are restrictions on commercialization. So I wrote this piece, if you're interested, on Llama 2, why it's not open source and why that's okay. And then we see the work that's going on with the open source initiative to try and define what AI is. And in the UK, it's been a very different scene. And we've seen the House of Lords do quite an interesting investigation. We responded to it, they quoted us, and actually the Baroness, who was leading this, spoke at our conference in February. And one of the things they've highlighted, which I'm really pleased about, is that closed source has a risk. Now, I think in America, you call it the hokey pokey. In the UK, we call it the hokey cokey, and you're sort of in, out, in, out. And that's pretty much what happened to Sam Altman last year. Was he CEO? Wasn't he CEO? Who knew what was going on? And that affected their customer base because they didn't have an open LLM where they knew what they could do. And they couldn't see what was in there. They couldn't move easily. They were locked into this closed LLM. And of course, you can't escape AI regulation. 16th of April, the first AI regulation in the world. It's dense, it's complex. And many are saying that it's a problem for open source. So thankfully, it doesn't apply for us in the UK, although we will have to live with it with our neighbours, all of you. However, on Friday, we had a bit of a shock. And these quotes are from a LinkedIn post that our Prime Minister pushed out at 4 o'clock on Friday. Who knew? We're not legislating, we knew that, but we're not legislating because we're pro-open source in the UK. Open source drives innovation, it creates startup, and it creates communities, says the Prime Minister. There must be a very high bar for any restrictions on open source. All good. Then they put a blinder, stroke of genius, something totally canny, and they took the AI testing tool and open sourced it. Now that testing tool is one which all the big tech companies committed to use to test their platforms, their LLMs, back at the Bletchley Summit last November. The AI testing unit, the AI Safety Institute, was concerned that they wouldn't be able to test all the platforms themselves. So what they've done is they've open sourced that platform on Friday, which means companies can build interfaces and start doing the testing. Small companies who might not have been tested can self-test. And of course, the UK can start to build an ecosystem, an open source ecosystem around AI testing and try and find itself a place in that AI landscape. So I think it's a stroke of genius. Let's see if they do it properly. So how do we fix this? How do we relieve that pressure? Well, we have to think about the future of open source. And to think about that, we have to teach people. We have to build skills. We have to teach curation. We have to teach governance and technical processes. We need to see this across the public sector, whether that's through the OSPOs that Europe has and the Central OSPO Open Source Programme Office, or whether it's through things like GDS. We need to teach our regulators this. They tend to think that this thing that you see stage left to your right as you look at it between closed and open is what open source is, whereas the reality for us is the other, open versus proprietary. And getting this orange box defined somewhere and understood is really important to the future of open source. And it's really important to policy, it's really important to laws so that they understand what the different risks are, because there is a hugely different risk in something being open and restricted, whether that's to who can use it or how they use it, from the free flow that definitions 5 and 6 of the open source definition allow. We also need to show value. We create 27% of the gross value add on the tech sector in the UK from open source, despite being that submarine under the digital economy. We all need to show in our own countries, show our governments, our policymakers, show the Commission what that value is. And we need to invest in our maintainers. And I know Linaro is, but many are not. And we need to invest in developing the skills to support them, bring more young people in, and we need to provide them with funding. And finally, we need to look at the digital public good that open source is and encourage our governments to commit more funds into it. So our survey will launch later today. Please, if you're in the UK, find the QR code if you don't take it now and do the survey for us. It takes a bit of work. It's a 20-minute thought process. We also have a manifesto. Our country is going to election later this year, and we're encouraging people to sign up to that. But we're not all about policy and hard work. We are also celebrating the 10th birthday of Kubernetes in London on the 6th of June. So if you have time, join us. Otherwise, I'm happy to talk to anybody about any of this. And I know it's dense and a lot of information, but thank you for your patience.